$28 million, 8 years, one rookie, and the second that number hit national television, the conversation stopped being polite. Because this wasn't just a deal, it was a detonation. The kind that rattles a league, exposes fault lines, and forces people to say what they usually whisper. Then Stephen A. Smith leaned forward. 5 words later, the studio went quiet. Not awkward quiet. Stunned quiet. You could feel it through the screen. Molly froze. The cameras stayed live, and Stephen A. didn't blink. Because he wasn't arguing basketball, he was arguing reality. Here's why this moment matters in the world of WNBA. Engaging stories. Nike didn't hand Caitlin Clark $28 million out of charity. They made a bet. A bet on eyeballs. On demand, on a player who moves culture, not just defenders. A bet on someone who sells tickets, jerseys, commercials, and conversation. And that's where the tension snapped, because when money shows up, it forces honesty. And honesty makes people uncomfortable, especially when success arrives faster than the system knows how to handle. On first take, the subtext finally became text. The question wasn't, is Caitlin good? Everyone knows she is. The question was, why her success felt threatening to some people, and why others wanted to pretend the deal was a mistake. Stephen A. saw through it. She's not the problem. That wasn't a defense. It was an indictment. Because if a rookie is bringing unprecedented attention to a league that's been begging for it, then blaming her makes no sense. If one player is lifting visibility, revenue, and relevance, then the discomfort isn't about fairness, it's about change. And when systems change, people panic, especially when power shifts quickly, especially when expectations are rewritten overnight, especially when a league that's been defined one way for decades suddenly has a new gravitational center. That's why the room went silent, not because Stephen A. was wrong, but because he said the quiet part out loud. This wasn't about Caitlin Clark taking something from anyone. It was about what her presence reveals about marketing, about opportunity, about how value is created and rewarded. And once that truth landed, nobody knew where to go next. Because if Caitlin isn't the problem, then the real conversation hasn't even started yet. And trust me, what happens next is where this story gets uncomfortable for everyone involved. Asterisk, here's where the narrative completely flips. Because once Stephen A. said, she's not the problem, the conversation wasn't about Caitlin Clark anymore. It was about who benefits when women's basketball finally breaks through and who feels exposed. When it does, think about it. For decades, the WNBA has fought for visibility, fought for TV slots, fought for endorsement dollars. Then one rookie walks in, and suddenly Nike drops a $28 million deal before she even plays a pro game. That doesn't create jealousy by accident. It creates panic. On that set, you could see it. Molly tried to reframe, to soften, to redirect the heat back toward fairness and context. But Stephen A. wasn't letting the conversation hide behind safe language, because safe language is how systems stay broken. He made one thing crystal clear. Caitlin Clark didn't negotiate that deal in a vacuum. Nike didn't spin a wheel. They followed numbers, ratings, search trends, ticket sales, social engagement, the uncomfortable truth. The market spoke. And markets don't care about feelings. They care about demand. That's what made the room so tense. Because once you admit that Caitlin's deal is based on valiant favoritism, then the argument collapses. You can't call it undeserved. You can't call it unfair. You can only ask why it took this long for a player to generate this kind of attention. And that question scares people, because it forces accountability. From networks, from sponsors, from the league itself. Stephen A. wasn't defending Caitlin the person. He was defending the principle that growth should be rewarded, not resented. That visibility should be amplified, not punished. That when a league finally gets a breakout star, the worst possible move is to turn her into a villain. And here's the line that never made the highlight clips. He said, if you're mad at her deal, be mad at the system that didn't create more deals like it before. That's when Molly went quiet, because there's no rebuttal to that. You can't argue with results. You can't argue with numbers. And you definitely can't argue with the fact that Caitlin Clark brought more eyes to women's basketball in 1 year than most marketing campaigns did in a decade. This is why this WNBA engaging story hits such a nerve. It's not about race-baiting headlines, it's not about tearing anyone down, it's about whether the league is ready to embrace growth, even when it doesn't arrive the way people expected. And once that door opens, there's one more truth waiting behind it, because if Caitlin Clark isn't the problem, then the resistance to her success tells us exactly where the real problem lives. Asterisk. This is where the conversation turns dangerous, because once you accept that Caitlin Clark earned that Nike deal, once you admit the numbers justify it, once you acknowledge the audience followed her, you're left with a question nobody wants to answer. Why does this success feel threatening? That's the tension Stephen A. forced into the open. Not with accusations, not with shouting, with logic. He pointed out something simple but explosive. Women's basketball didn't suddenly become marketable. It's always been marketable. The infrastructure just never fully committed to telling its stories the right way, until now. Caitlin Clark didn't take opportunities away from anyone. She exposed how many opportunities were left on the table for years. And when people realized that, the discomfort wasn't about her, it was about lost time, lost momentum, lost investment, lost belief. That's why the reaction was so intense, because when one player becomes a lightning rod, it forces everyone else to ask hard questions. Why weren't more players marketed like this before? Why did it take a cultural moment to unlock what should have been obvious? Why did it take controversy to create conversation? Stephen A. said what most analysts tiptoe around. Growth doesn't come evenly. It comes explosively. And when it does, someone is always accused of being too much, too visible, too hyped, too rewarded, too soon. That's the pattern. And here's where Molly went silent, not because she lost an argument, but because there was nowhere left to pivot. Every angle circled back to the same truth. Blaming Caitlin Clark is easier than confronting systemic failure. Easier than asking why the league struggled to build stars consistently. Easier than questioning media priorities. Easier than admitting that fans respond to storytelling rivalries and access. Caitlin became the symbol because symbols are easier to argue about than systems. And Stephen A. refused to let the conversation stay shallow. He made it clear, you don't fix inequity by tearing down the person who breaks through. You fix it by building more pathways behind her. That's what made this one of the most uncomfortable WNBA engaging stories of the year, because for the first time, a mainstream voice said the quiet part plainly. If this moment is handled wrong, the league risks sabotaging its own growth. And the irony, the very attention people resent, is the attention everyone has been asking for. So, now the league and its audience stand at a crossroads. Do you celebrate momentum, or do you police it? Because how this moment is treated won't just define Caitlin Clark's era. It will define whether women's basketball finally learns how to grow without tearing itself apart. And that brings us to the final reveal. Because Stephen A. didn't just defend Caitlin, he issued a warning. Asterisk, this is the part most people missed, because Stephen A. Smith wasn't just defending Caitlin Clark in that moment. He was drawing a line in the sand, a warning wrapped in calm logic. He said, in essence, if you turn your biggest growth moment into an internal war, you will lose everything you just gained. That's the real message. Caitlin Clark's Nike deal wasn't the end of a conversation. It was the beginning of one that WNBA can't afford to dodge. A conversation about visibility, about investment, about what happens when a league finally breaks through and doesn't know how to handle the spotlight. Stephen A. made it clear. This isn't about crowning one player and ignoring the rest. It's about leverage. Caitlin opened a door, a massive one, and now the league has a choice. Walk through it together, or slam it shut out of spite. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Moments like this don't come often. You don't get many chances where a rookie pulls in casual fans, mainstream media, and corporate dollars all at once. When that happens, the smartest move isn't to argue over who deserves what. It's to build more marketing, more storytelling, more stars lifted, not fewer. That's why Molly went silent. Not because she agreed with everything Stephen A. said, but because the logic cornered the argument. There was no villain left to point at. Caitlin didn't create the imbalance. She revealed it, and that's why this WNBA engaging story matters beyond one TV segment. Because how the league responds now will decide its next decade. If Caitlin's success becomes a wedge, growth stalls. If it becomes a foundation, everyone rises. Stephen A.'s final point landed harder than any hot take. You don't punish the person who brings opportunity. You build systems so more people can share it. That's the difference between leagues that grow and leagues that fracture under pressure. Caitlin Clark didn't ask to be the face of this moment. Nike didn't force the league's hand. Stephen A. didn't create the tension. They just exposed it. So, the real question isn't whether Caitlin deserves her deal. The question is whether the WNBA is ready.